Hey everybody, my name is Mike Montgomery, and today I'd like to show you how I built this knockdown, fold-up, and portable desk, or table really, on Modern Builds. So this project is all a part of the Rockler Plywood Challenge, which is a single-sheet plywood challenge put on by my podcast, The Modern Maker Podcast. And I will talk more about this at the end of the video, but for now, let's get started. Ben and I decided to travel down to Chris's house to record the episode of the podcast where we announced the challenge. And while we were there, I figured I would take advantage of his CNC from Inventables to build this desk. The first thing I needed to do was cut down my sheet of 3/4 inch plywood into the blanks for the legs. Then, one at a time, we could load them into his X-Carve and cut the legs out. Now, I modeled these in SketchUp and I actually put a video on my second channel showing how I modeled them. So if you're interested in working with angles and some interesting geometry, that might be a good video to check out. The first passes that you're seeing here is just removing some material from the inside of the legs. This lightens everything up so that it's a bit more portable and gives it a little bit more of an interesting look. On the outside pass, I cut the tenons for the tops of the legs as well as the mortise on the backs for the stretchers. Once all the cuts were complete and I took everything back to Joshua Tree, I sanded all of the inside of the cuts to remove any burn marks, and I used a file to clean up that mortise where the stretcher is going to go. Speaking of the stretcher, I cut that piece out of the same sheet of plywood and then I cut it to length on Chris's miter saw. Now of course, while I'm in the 4i shop, I had to take advantage of that awesome cabinet saw that he has, and I used that to make the lap joints that will go into the mortise on the legs. If I was making a permanent desk, of course I would use glue and screws so that everything was as strong as possible, but because I want it to be portable, I need to use mechanical fasteners. For the legs, I used T-nuts. They're just threaded inserts with teeth on them that allow it to dig into the wood and stay put. I'll leave a link to those in the description along with everything else I'm using. After failing with an F-style clamp for a while, I realized that vice grips work really well for getting these dug into the wood. The ones I use have 1/4-20 threads, so I just used a bolt to attach the stretchers to the legs, 2 on each side. Now really quickly, we're going to travel back in time to the 4i shop where I laid out the legs on the bottom of what will be the tabletop to figure out what size I needed to cut it to. I did get to try out Chris's track saw, but if I'm being honest, a circular saw works just as well. Either way, back in Joshua Tree, it was time to cut the mortises for the tenons on the tops of the legs to go through. Now whenever I was modeling this, I made sure that the tenons were 3/4 of an inch tall, that way it would match my 3/4 inch thick plywood. So when I cut all of those holes, hopefully those tenons will show through and sit flush with the rest of the tabletop. Of course it wasn't perfect, so I did sand them down a little bit to make sure they were a perfect fit. In hindsight, I do wish that I used Chris's CNC to cut these mortises. If you've ever used a jigsaw, you know that your lines usually aren't perfect, although I did use a file to try and square everything up as best I could. And while I was already cutting holes into the tabletop, I laid out some lines for some slots towards the back of the desk. This way I could feed power cords or USB cables through it and keep a much tidier tabletop. I also went ahead and used a bigger Forstner bit so that I could make a handhold so it would be easy to pick up and carry. The Forstner bits serve 2 purposes. One, it gives you a place to drop your jigsaw in so that you could cut the rest of the slots out. It also makes a really clean radius on the ends of each of those cutouts so that everything looks a little bit more pro. Then finally, I got my trim router with a small round-over bit, and I rounded over those slots, the handhold, and the edges of the desk so that everything was just softened up a little bit. So like you saw in the beginning of the video, the legs and the stretcher disassemble and attach to the bottom of the tabletop to be transported, and the way they attach is with magnets. I just drilled a hole on the bottom of the table for each of those magnets and corresponding holes on the legs and the stretcher so that when everything comes together, it snaps and holds in place really well. I use Gorilla Glue Gel, which has a really quick set time and doesn't run like traditional super glue. I'll leave that linked in the description. And while I was at Home Depot picking up those magnets, I saw a spray paint called Robin's Egg from Rust-Oleum. It's a super soft blue, almost a pastel, and I thought that would look really nice on the bottom of the legs. So I masked off the bottoms of the legs following the same angle as the cutouts on those legs, and I painted on about 3 coats. Once that was dry, I came back with more painter's tape and I masked off a 3/4 inch stripe and painted the bottoms of the legs pure white. I made sure to buy satin white paint so that it matched the same finish as the robin's egg blue. Then, once everything dried after a few coats, I could remove that masking tape to reveal a really subtle, really clean blue line. As you can tell, it is not a super loud, contrasty mix, but that is what I wanted. I wanted everything to kind of sit back and be really tasteful, and I think it did. The assembly process for this desk is incredibly simple. You just remove the legs and insert those tenons into the mortises. Make sure everything is sitting super flush. Then you can attach the stretchers with the 2 screws on each side, and that is pretty much it. Now, of course, this is a prototype and it is a little bit wobbly, but what's so cool is that it's super light. One person can flip this, rotate it, move it around, super easy. Seeing this project come to fruition was really awesome. Being able to model something that would have been a nightmare to cut in real life, having a machine do it and watch everything assemble the way it did was amazing. And that's what this whole challenge is all about. It's about pushing yourself creatively, coming up with something that you wouldn't have done normally out of a single sheet of plywood.
Thanks for watching these plywood projects. These are actually part of a challenge that my friend Mike here will tell you a little bit more about.
Yeah, so this is all a part of the Rockler Single Sheet Plywood Challenge, and it's put on by the Modern Maker podcast. We are 2/3 of that podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe like 3/4?
The most important 2/3.
Exactly. Chris isn't here, but he's a good guy, and we'll Photoshop his face next to Ben.
So what we're trying to do is create projects that you guys can participate in. And so what these challenges are they're a little bit of a competition, meaning that there's prizes, but more so they're just a starting point so that everyone in our community can work on the same ideas at the same time. So we want to see what you can make out of 1 sheet of plywood.
Now, we're not going to be sticklers on rules. You can add materials, you can add concrete, epoxy, paint, anything that can make your project more creative. Just don't use more than a single sheet. And that means 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch if you can get it. Just build the coolest thing you can out of a single sheet.
And you don't have to remember all the rules because we'll put a link in the description box below where you can read all the fine print.
modernmakerpodcast.com/plywood-challenge.
And check out the podcast if you haven't already.
Yeah, if you haven't already, what are you doing anyways? Awesome, so have fun, be creative.
And yeah, get to work.
There we go.
All right, we got it.
Yeah, that'll work.